Crisis and conflict-affected regions across Africa continue to undermine stability and disrupt livelihoods. On September 21st, 2024, on the occasion of the International Day of Peace, the African Union called for concerted continental efforts to address the growing peace and security threats across Africa that are mainly emanating from the scourges of terrorism and armed conflicts. Similarly, the African Union Peace Fund has taken a significant step towards fostering peace and stability by disbursing $7 million. This allocation represents 70% of the approved peace fund crisis reserve facility ceiling for the year 2024, reaffirming the bloc's commitment to self-reliance in financing essential initiatives aimed at conflict prevention initiatives across the African continent. Indeed, these countries primarily are Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Sahelian countries of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, as well as others. Then we ask ourselves the question, between conflicts and crisis, what is at the center of this havoc plaguing the African continent? And we're asking the question today, what is destabilizing Africa? Ladies and gentlemen, join us on today's conversation. Stay with us. Hello, Africa and the world. Thank you for saving the rendezvous this day on Talking Point of your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Like you heard in our preamble, today we're discussing amidst the plethora of challenges plaguing the African continent, asking the question, what is destabilizing Africa amidst these numerous crises that the continent is facing, from economic impasse to security threats amidst others? That is the question for today. And ladies and gentlemen, to evoke today's topic of discussion, I'm been joined all the way here from Cameroon by Mr. NJINE BANEH, who is a political analyst and a journalist. He doubles as the Secretary General of the Popular Actions Party. Thank you immensely, sir, for taking our time to join us on today's edition of the program.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for inviting me. It's true, it's been a very long time since I last took part on your platform. I want to send a special greeting to all your viewers and to my co-panelists in the studio, and to say it's a pleasure to be with you once again today.
Edition of Talking Point. Meanwhile, I'll take you out of the African continent to be joined by Ms. OPEOLUWA TAIWO, who is the Executive Director of the Africa Bridge Initiative, joining us all the way from Lagos. Thank you immensely, sir, for taking our time out of your busy schedule to be with us this day.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be here today. Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure. Meanwhile, out of the African continent, all the way to the United States, we've been joined by Dr. STANLEY, FONGOD, Pan-Africanist economist and CEO of Crises Fintech. Thank you immensely, Doc, for taking our time to be with us.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure. Meanwhile,
for participating.
Thank you so much. Meanwhile, we shall equally acknowledge the contribution of Mr. Gilbert Kimby, a marketing consultant, who shall be contributing all the way here from Cameroon. And to start today's conversation, which I'll debate with you, Mr. Engineer ELVIS, as an expert, a journalist, political analyst, and much more, when you get the term destabilization, especially in the context of the African continent, what would you say, as an expert, is destabilizing Africa? Okay, meanwhile, we are striving to get to Mr. NJINE BANEH. As I mentioned in our preamble, we will be discussing what is destabilizing the African continent. That means the numerous challenges that are plaguing the continent of Africa. That is, means the security challenges, the economic crisis, climate change, amidst others. That is political instability, and many more that have been plaguing the continent in recent years. Today we're asking that question: what is destabilizing Africa? And of course, that leads me to the first question with you, Mr. NJINE BANEH. When you listen to the destabilization within the African continent, amidst the crisis, what means the numerous conflicts that are plaguing Africa, what would you say is destabilizing Africa?
Well, madam, I think I would say both the crisis and the conflicts are interrelated, and that both actually do destabilize the African continent, because it would be somehow difficult to try to distinguish between the crisis and the conflict on the African continent, though we understand that when we talk about crises, sometimes they are short-lived. They are events that warrant an immediate action to be able to harness them, but when we allow them to pursue, they could eventually lead to conflicts. So I think that both do destabilize the African continent because they are interrelated, but then focus most often than not is laid on the conflicts per se, because in this case we actually see a visible physical exchange, most often with arms, between individuals and the states or groups of individuals or international conflicts and things of that nature. So coming back to the question as to what is it that actually destabilizes the African continent between crisis and conflict, I will simply say again that the both, to me, actually do contribute enormously in destabilizing the African continent. The question here is to find out how the different governments in place actually do try to handle these different situations. Because like I started by saying already, when we talk about crisis, sometimes these are events that come up, perhaps sometimes unforeseen circumstances, but that need immediate urgent actions to be able to handle them, because when you do not handle them carefully, they could eventually get into conflict. But the conflicts themselves too are also there, because sometimes there are situations that had long been neglected, be it by the authorities that be, and so at the end of the day, you find individuals or groups of individuals that come up, and because of several grievances that they do have, and perhaps because they had not been given room to express themselves freely in certain political spheres, they now choose to turn to the use of maybe physical violence to be able to either let their ideas go through or to actually express themselves.
Thank you so much, Ms. NJINE. Now, just getting from you, and I'll direct this next question to you, Mr. OPEOLUWA. You listen to Mr. NJINE ELVIS. He says that conflicts and crises on the African continent are interrelated, but it's left for the various leaders, the various governments, to be able to see how to mitigate or pass through all these challenges for the betterment of their populations. Now, in your opinion, what would you say is at the origin, or better still, at the heart of this destabilization which we're seeing within Africa?
All right, so thank you for that question. One thing we must understand for Africa as a continent, there are two sides of a coin, and there are two legs to every man. So on one hand, we're having a crisis. On another hand, we're having conflicts. So these are two man-made activities within the African continent. Mark my word. These are two man-made activities bedeviling our continent. So what does that say to us? That says to us that the origin of conflict, the origin of crisis within the continent of Africa is not a natural cause. That means it was caused, it was created by the Africans, especially by the elites within the system. And why do I say so? We are talking about conflict and crisis that is religious inclined, that is resource-based inclined. When we talk about politics, we talk about the authoritative allocation of value. That is, who gets what, when, and how. And each time there is conversation around resources, especially when the motive behind the sharing of those resources are not intentional and are not straightforward, there's bound to be what? Conflict and crisis. And that is a challenge we are having in Africa. And that shows to us that if our challenges are man-made, then the solution can also be tend to be what? Man-made. So we are having artificial crisis, artificial conflict. Then the solution, since we created the problem, that means the solution lies within us also. The solution does not lie with the Western world. Africa, like I usually say, can only be developed by the true and intentional African leaders.
Thank you so much, Mr. OPEOLUWA TAIWO, who is joining us all the way from Nigeria. Now, we now proceed with you, Dr. FONGOD. You listened to your co-panelists who cited that the conflicts or crises that are plaguing the African continent are man-made, or better still, and could be solved using solutions within the African continent. Now, do you share that opinion?
In most, in most ways I do, and I think that some of the reasons why I am a little bit quite maybe a little bit apprehensive so far as these things are concerned has a lot to do with the fact that we are dealing with conflicts and we are also talking about crisis. So if you just break that down a little bit to figure out exactly what kind of conflicts we are experiencing on the African continent, you realize that we are dealing with issues that are politically motivated. All right, we are dealing with a lot of almost all the conflicts we have on the continent of Africa, except those are based on terrorism. Almost all the conflicts are based on bad governance. They are based on folks who basically want to remain in power, without any recourse. These are people who basically want to do whatever it takes to be in power, and as a result of that, we have these conflicts that are basically emerging. We also have the issues of crisis, and these ones will be economic crisis. We have also humanitarian crisis based upon farming. We have crisis based upon climate, and we also have health crisis that is basically, pushing us across the continent of Africa in many fronts. So as a result of all of these crises, be it conflict, be it the crisis that we are facing, obviously there is always this issues of destabilizing the continent. So either people are moving as a result of the conflict, or people are moving as a result of the crisis. One way or the other, the continent in itself is facing a whole lot of backlash. So number one, if you look at it being man-made, then obviously in the areas of conflict, that is where the man-made component basically comes in. But when you look at the areas of crisis, some of those are actually natural. They are, they are not man-made, they're just natural occurrences. But obviously also in terms of the crisis, they are those that are man-made. If you look at what Nigeria is going through right now, those are man-made. If you look at, especially when it comes to the economic crisis that they are facing right now, I think a couple of months ago, I was in Nigeria, and a liter of oil in Nigeria was about 800, I think it was about 800 naira. Now I just got the information, it's about 1,600. All right, the whole damn thing has doubled, 100% ever since just a couple of months ago, about 3-4 months ago. So we're dealing with man-made crises, and those man-made crises are obviously, what is driving most of the issues that we face on the continent of Africa in that regard. My point is there has to be a concerted effort across many fronts on how we can be able to find ways to mitigate the situation, how we can be able to find ways to be able to fully understand it, both, be it on political terms and economic terms. We really have to bring folks together. The reality is, if you look at the economic sufferings that people are having on the continent of Africa, that is the singular unit that is driving everybody else into conflict. In an environment where the economic front is doing very well, and even if you have the political front not doing so well in relationship to free and fair elections or democracy, but as long as the people have food, as long as the standard of living is high, as long as the human development index, it's basically doing what it's supposed to do. We are talking about hospitals, we are talking about standard of living, we are talking about education. As long as those index, it's quite good, everybody is okay. Once the economic outlook also, which basically talks about the GDP, and the distribution and the distribution of wealth within the nation, once those are doing well, nobody seems to complain. But the problem is, is we have people in power that have created a very toxic environment in economic front and politically, that in the end, the people really have nothing to lose than to get on the street and create all kind of chaos, or people just pick up arms and start fighting. That's the reality in which we are in. So in other words, whatever happens with the economic crisis we face, whatever happens with the issues of conflict, all of this in reality, and in support to what my brother said, really have a human component to it. Howbeit, there's a small portion of that is natural, that we basically has to be able to learn how to take care of, but a huge portion of it, it's actually man-made.
Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD, but we'll not proceed without getting the contribution of Mr. Gilbert Kimbe. Now, as far as these paralleling numerous challenges, that is the conflicts and crises plaguing Africa is concerned, what's your take as far as this numerous crisis is concerned within the African continent, Mr. Gilbert? Unfortunately, Mr. Gilbert, can you hear us? Please kindly proceed as far as the spiraling conflicts on the African continent is concerned. What's your take on that? We're hoping on Mr. Gilbert to get to us. I'll direct a question to Mr. Engineer ELVIS BANEH. You listened to Dr. FONGOD as far as that is concerned, why he elucidated that some of the crises within Africa, be it crises, be it conflicts, could be man-made, while others are just natural. When you look at the landscape of the African continent, with the numerous challenges that Africa is facing, do you believe that at some level the say governments that are put in place, the various stakeholders, do have a role to play? Because we're asking the question today, what is destabilizing the African continent? Could we say that at the level of leadership, there is some, say, part of the blame is actually supposed to be portioned to what's happening within the African continent?
Actually, madam, what you realize is that when we talk about crises, we talk about conflicts across the African continent, most often than not, they do stem from bad governance. And if we are accusing bad governance, automatically we are accusing the leadership of the various countries, you see, because when you look across the African continent, it is as though it has become a part and parcel of Africans. It is as though it has become a culture, a style of living, that there must be a high cost of living across the African continent. There is this issue of tribalism, for instance, that you find across African countries. There is the issue of mediocrity. In other words, people who find themselves in offices where they do not qualify or merit to occupy them, but simply because someone knows someone somewhere who knows someone somewhere. At the end of the day, you occupy an office that where you do not understand exactly your prerogatives in that office. And so at the end of the day, you find people who manage public affairs as though they are managing the wallet in their pocket. So in a nutshell, we say there is bad governance, and if there is bad governance, there is someone to accuse or who are accountable for that, who are, of course, the leaders. These are some of the things that eventually lead into crisis situations in the different African countries across the continent. And like I earlier mentioned, sometimes these crises eventually degenerate into conflicts. And why? Simply because sometimes the problems that eventually lead into conflicts, actually some individuals or citizens, denizens sometimes detect them. They start trying to express themselves and to point out that this or that thing is not being done the right way. But those who hold power do not actually give room for people to express their views politically free, without being intimidated, without some being imprisoned, without some being jailed. Some even sometimes find themselves obliged to go on exile or are forced to leave their countries simply because no one will want to listen to them. And so when it gets to a certain point when people can no longer bear it, what happens? They have no other choice than to look for, like I earlier mentioned, a physical violent means perhaps to want to express themselves. And remember that sometimes when it gets to conflict, it's not often because maybe the masses or some individuals saw violence as the best option. But that sometimes even when you go out for what we call peaceful, democratic, peaceful demonstrations, Some regimes will not even permit you at that level to be able to express your political views. It is like either you take what they offer or nothing else. Either you take what they offer or you keep quiet. So I still am one of those who think that's true. We may have some instances where crises or conflicts could be independent of the regimes or the governments that be of the authorities, but in a greater to a greater extent, I think that our leaders are somehow responsible for a greater proportion of the crisis situation or the conflicts that we face across the African continent. Why? Because they sometimes take decisions that are not quite the best and are not willing to take to advice from any other person, especially when you are not of their clan, especially when you are not of their system. They naturally see in you an outsider. They actually see in you someone of the opposition who is fighting against their own interest. And why? Because their interest in most cases is private and not the general good of all the nationals in the countries that, as the case may be.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mbane. Now, just to proceed with you, Mr. OPEOLUWA, listen to what your co-panelists had to say. Just in that line, when you look at the numerous efforts that have been put so far in a bid to quell some of these conflicts on the African continent and, of course, reduce some of the crises that Africa is facing, like a co-panelist said, sometimes it might be some of the loopholes as a result of the loopholes that happen in leadership. But then, amidst all these numerous efforts that have been put in place, why do you think the African continent still seems to be on one spot? It's not moving as far as evolving from these numerous challenges is concerned. Mr. OPEOLUWA.
We talk about, yeah, can you hear me? Can
yes,
you hear me
I
clearly?
can. Proceed, please.
All right, so let's do more of practical now than theory. Okay, so we talk about conflicts on one hand. Then we talk about crisis on another hand. Now when we talk about conflicts, we are talking about what happened to Democratic Republic of Congo. We are talking about Mozambique, South Sudan. We're talking about what? Political, ethnic tension within the system. Then we also talk about the terrorist group like Boko Haram in Nigeria. For instance, now, you cannot go to Adamawa State, you cannot go to Zamfara State, you cannot go to Borno State without any security attachment to your vehicle. So what does that mean? There is a crisis within the system. And that crisis is becoming an intercontinental crisis affecting Niger Republic, affecting Democratic Republic of Congo, affecting Mali, affecting Nigeria. So many local governments in Nigeria has been taken over by Boko Haram. All right, we also have crisis situations such as what? Economic problem, hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. For instance now, like my co-pilot, the doctor said, talking about Nigeria, 2-3 months down the line, we are having fuel of 800, 700. Whereas today now, we are talking about 1,600, 1,700 naira. So what does that mean? An average businessman cannot cope anymore. I was with a, what do you call it, Uber driver about 2-3 days ago, going for a speaking engagement that I had. And the man told me personally that he's actually working under pressure, that his blood pressure is actually high. Because why? Even though he's working, he cannot meet his daily need. The children, the family are suffering because the car is on the road, and instead of fueling the car with about 10,000, 20,000 naira, he has to fuel the car for 50,000 naira. The question is, where do we go from here? So we can see that economic crisis within a nation, within a continent, has what? Metamorphosed into various unexplainable conflicts. Because every rich man in Africa do not want to become poor. So what does that mean? There is already a class struggle within the African continent. The upper class is fighting the lower class. The lower class is fighting the middle class. So what does that mean? There will be continuous conflict within the system. And that is why every analyst will tell you that the first thing we need to do is to stabilize the conflict between different classes of the society. Africa is working more on the capitalist system of economy, and that is becoming a demonic influence on. We are running away from the background of our economy. Like I usually say, the background of the economy of Africa is on agriculture. But when the political leaders come into power, they are looking for easy way out to make money, easy way out to continue to be in power, which I call the what? Sit-tight syndrome. So in all of this activity, their activities as political elites is fueling this conflict within and outside the continent. And that is why we can see that the same leaders that are fueling this conflict through this economic crisis are also running to the Western world for solution, forgetting that the solution will not come from the outside. And where will the solution come from? The solution will come from the people of Africa. And African people must understand that the citizen must rise up to our responsibility as a people. We must ask the right questions from our leaders at the right time. Sit-tight syndrome will continue in the political space of Africa as long as the citizens are docile in nature. When you are afraid of death as a citizen of Africa, economic crisis is already killing people in Nigeria. People cannot afford 3 square meals anymore. That is already death in advance. So why are we still scared of guns? Because the biggest gun in Africa is the food crisis. And how do we ensure that we suppress this food crisis? The answer is the citizens of Africa must rise up. The leaders will not give us the solution. We must demand the solution, and we must take the bull by the horn from the leaders of Africa. That is where we are as of today.
Indeed, that is where the African continent finds itself as of this day. Ladies and gentlemen, we're discussing in between conflicts and crises within the African continent. We're asking ourselves the question, what is destabilizing the African continent in a bid to find solutions to some of the pressing challenges facing the African continent. Meanwhile, we've gotten from Mr. OPEOLUWA TAIWO, which is all the way from Nigeria. And I will direct this next question to you, Dr. Stanley FONGOD. Now you listen to the point of view of Mr. OPEOLUWA as far as the present situation within Africa is concerned. I believe you're one of those pundits that will subscribe to the idea that Africa needs to solve its problems through African solutions. While we're advocating for the Ubuntu perspective, the Ubuntu perspective to all problems within Africa, when you look at present-day Africa, the present continent, Africa is gradually approaching. There's this rapprochement between Africa and different partners within the African continent. When you look at some of these crises, do you believe that amidst these partnerships that are occurring, Africa do have, if Africans come together, then there is a way out of these numerous conflicts and crises? Because Mr. OPEOLUWA cited the case of food security within Africa. How do you think Africans can go about this? Do you think solidarity could play a key role in actually overturning the situation?
Well, you know, the reality is that what he stated was, basically factual. I might not agree with a couple of, things, especially when it comes to the area of us, experiencing a capitalist system, because I think that, in my opinion, that's the only system that has brought great prosperity to the world. I think that what we miss, especially as economists, is to be able to understand that there is a great contrast between the Human Development Index and whatever it is that we are looking at so far as something like, the economic outlook is concerned. And the reason why we need to be able to fully understand this is because I keep saying, I think that I'm probably the only one in the world who basically has this, which is the Human Economic Index. No one uses that particular term. I keep using that particular term, Human Economic Index. And I've written about this, hopefully that will be published soon. And the reason for that is because if we look at just the Human Development Index alone, what we're looking at things like life expectancy. We're looking at things like education. We're looking at things like, income. But when you look at just that particular index, it does not say a lot about, what is happening within the economy, because obviously everybody is looking at the economic outlook. So you're looking at something like the GDP. And as a result of that, we must be able to marry the two together. You can have a country whose GDP is doing very great. I mean, everything looks, the outlook is, the GDP, it's good. Everyone is celebrating. But then the reality is that the conditions of those in that particular society, it's not that great at all. What is the level of literacy in that particular community? What is the life expectancy? And life expectancy, we start asking, what is the notion, how good is the healthcare system? And all of that. So once we basically marry those two together, those two indexes together, then in my opinion, we have what we call the Human Economic Index. And that way we have an overall health as far as the nation is concerned. And I think that is one pause we need to be able to take and fully understand, without which we'll be treating one thing when one thing is happening. It's as if to say somebody has cancer, that is, probably at the level of the colon, and there's another cancer somewhere at the level of the of the prostate. You basically have to yank those things out simultaneously. Otherwise, if you're treating one, then one is ruling out here. That does not help the overall health of the body. And that is why I think that we must be able to marry these two indexes together. If that was going to be the case, the reality is we need to be able to use a scalpel, all right, laser in a particular economy, and then try to find out what works in this economy and what is not working in this economy. In most, of course, obviously on the African continent, agriculture seems to be a huge sector that we need to be able to dive into, because that is where most of us participate so far as the economy is concerned. But so far as I'm concerned, that is wrong. Not that agriculture is wrong, not that we should not participate in this circle, but the idea is that we need to be able to diversify our economy and then grow. A robust middle class will simply means that we have manufacturing, that we have industries, that we are able to convert whatever it is that we're producing. Either we're producing that from the agricultural perspective, or we're doing so in mining, that we're able to convert these raw materials into semi to finished goods. We need to be able to build up industries. That's the only way, the economy basically strive. The private sector needs to have this energy. We have to be able to push the private sector, into basically robust economic growth. And the only way we should also be able to bring in foreign direct investors into our economy is when they see that the private sector is thriving. They see that there's diversification in the economy, because there are investors out there who are only specialized or, going to put their money in certain sectors. And once you have an economy where those sectors are non-existent, for example, you have somebody who is gifted in telecom, or someone who is gifted in, data centers, and yet you have an economy that has zero data centers and none of that is happening. There are secondary industries that needs to rise as a result of data center infrastructures. There are other industries that will rise as a result of, fiber optic distribution across a wide area where high-speed internet capabilities is given to everyone. Once those industries are not there, other industries, for example, that will come in the areas of content distribution will not be there. Telecommunications, cybersecurity, home intrusion detection technology, all of those industries will basically not exist because there are no infrastructures for those industries to rise. So we really need to be able to find ways in which we can basically diversify our economies, bring in all the areas, grow some other areas of the economy that is just outside of, the primary ones that we already have. And then as much as we're trying to perfect this, the areas of agriculture, we're trying to perfect the areas of mining, we need to also be able to start thinking how we can begin to build other industries so that we can eventually get all of these young people, back to work. If we don't grow our economy, the reality is not everybody is going to be involved in farming. A time will come when we'll produce so much that we need to export, and unfortunately, we'll not be able to do so because most of what we produce might not be something that we can be able to sell outside of the continent. So we really must diversify. I think that the key word over here for us to actually be able to solve some of the issues we have on the African continent when it comes, to the issues we're facing with conflict, because conflicts is born out of poor governance. But then once you get people who are quite hungry, who are desperate, who are educated, who have been through school and they have no jobs, that becomes the bedrock for either insurgency. I think studies have proven that once you have young people or unemployed people, that gives rise, especially if you look at what's happening in northern Nigeria, the rise of the Boko Haram was as a result of a lot of young people who have probably been to school or not been to school, but one common denominator for most of them is they were unemployed. And once they are unemployed, then they becomes, the playground for whatever Islamic ideology, will hold sway in that part of the world. So we have to be able to get young people to work. And the only way I think we should be able to do so is to diversify our economy, bring in a whole lot of, people who can be able to build up the middle class by bringing factories, industries, building up other sectors of the economy rather than the primary sectors that we have. We can say whatever we want to say concerning Nigeria. The reality is we have zero diversification so far as the economy is concerned. We must diversify, not just in case of Nigeria, but in case of the continent as a whole.
FONGOD, just to highlight to our audience that, of course, you cited that Africa needs to diversify its economy for it to be able to push forward. And the way going forward that we need to do this is to invest or reinvest in agriculture. Now, we earlier on announced that we had Gilbert Kimbe, who was contributing in the course of this program, but we lost him earlier on, which has got indications that is back. As far as Africa, we had your co-panelist, Mr. Gilbert, that cited that Africa needs to diversify its economy if it needs to move forward in a bid to curb some of the challenges that are plaguing the continent, notably the conflicts and the numerous crises. Now, in your opinion, what is the interrelation between this, and how would you rate these spiraling challenges that are facing the continent of Africa?
Thank you, Madam Nabeseh, for this important question. Yeah, the conflict and crises we see across Africa are very concerning and have serious effects on the continent's future. So from the civil war in Sudan to the fighting in Mozambique and the ongoing issues in Cameroon's Anglophone regions, these problems are not just random events. They actually show deeper issues. Many conflicts arise from a mix of bad governance, economic inequality, and ethnic and religious tensions. So, for instance, the civil unrest in Sudan is rooted in years of political oppression and lack of economic opportunities, making many people feel left out. And in Cameroon, the Anglophone community feels ignored by, a government that mainly represents the Francophone majority. So this feeling of exclusion has led to, a long-lasting conflict that displaces many people and disrupts local economies. So these conflicts not only affect the lives of millions, but it also creates instability in neighboring countries, leading to refugee crises and affecting regional security. So the international community is rightly worried because these issues prevent economic growth and it undermines the potential for a peaceful and prosperous continent. It is actually crucial for African nations to confront these challenges and work together to find a lasting solution that tackles the root causes, of these conflicts. So by so doing and addressing these core issues, I believe that we can build a more peaceful and inclusive future, for everyone on our continent, Africa.
Mr. Gilbert Kimbe, and now you started a point which is in sync with what one of your former co-panelists said so far, that the origin of this crisis, which we have seen on the African continent, or at the origin of the conflicts as well, could be this issue of bad governance within some nations. And now, with this perspective in mind, in your opinion, as an African, what would you say is at the origin, from your own point of view, of these challenges facing the African continent?
Yeah, Madam Nabise, the challenges Africa faces today come from a mix of historical and modern problems. Many conflicts on the continent can be traced back to colonial times, when borders were drawn without considering ethnic and cultural realities. These created countries that often had conflicting groups living together. After gaining independence, many African nations struggled with governance, struggled with facing issues like corruption and lack of inclusive politics. This exclusion has often led to violence. So, for example, in Cameroon, the Anglophone minority feels marginalized, leading to ongoing conflicts. In Ethiopia, historical ethnic rivalries have resurfaced, resulting in the Trickery crisis. We also have economic disparities, high youth unemployment, and competition for resources like land and minerals that further fuel tensions. So these factors create a dangerous mix, making it easy, for grievances to turn into real violence. This circle of conflict impacts not only individual nations, but the entire continent. So understanding this historical context is essential for developing effective strategies to promote peace and to also resolve conflicts. So we must address the root causes in order to create a stable and a united Africa.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Gilbert. We just got indications. We apologize for the technical hitches. Mr. OPEOLUWA is back with us. Welcome back, sir. Like you listened, your co-panelists were citing that we have issues, some historical ties that could be linked to the spiraling conflicts and crises within the African continent. So, looking at ways through which Africa can mitigate some of these challenges, what would you say? Because recently we saw a fund that was allocated by the African Union to be able to resolve some of the numerous crises plaguing the African continent to the tune of about $7 million US. Now, when you look at some funds like this, given we've cited that Africa has been going through a lot of challenges in recent years without any palpable solutions being brought to the table, do you think that this fund is going to really go a long way in curbing some of these challenges? Mr. OPEOLUWA, can you hear me?
Africa. Yeah,
please proceed, please.
Now. All right, so when we talk about conflict and crisis in Africa, all right, so we are talking about various activities within the system, destabilizing, pulling back the development, the growth of the continent. All right. So, addressing these challenges, we need what we call comprehensive approach. And when we talk about comprehensive approach to solving the problem of Africa, there's a traditional approach and there is a developmental approach. The traditional approach, talking about for us looking inward and using our foundation to generate the solution. Our foundation in culture, our foundation in agriculture, our foundation in tourism. When we are talking about inflows from the Western world, the donations, the grants, you can see what happened from China recently, about 51 or $57 billion investment coming to Africa. That alone can never be sufficient for Africa. Even though if the figures will be sufficient for Africa, the process, the environment, and the inflation will make it not to be sufficient for Africa as a country or as a continent. So what do I mean? When we look at the traditional approach, looking at our foundation, when we go back to the foundation, like the economists will say, going back to the drawing board. When we go back to the drawing board, look at our foundation, then we can understand that we have solution through our traditional approach. If Dubai can be developed through real estate, through tourism, what stops Africa from coming out of the shackles of economic quagmire through what? Through tourism and through traditional cultural development. Now, when we look at the developmental approach, we talk about aligning and realigning our people with the Western world. What brought out the solution to India? What brought out the solution to China? They looked inward and they brought out their vibrant youth and they spread them to different Western world for different and many decades. And they come back with economic resources and with mental capacity to develop China and India. So if Africa can also look at this developmental approach, though it will cost us a longer time, but we can get to the promised land without any further internal crisis or conflict.
Thank you so much. Yeah, please proceed.
More on developmental approach. All right. So that developmental approach will bring AI development. It will bring the fintech development. It will bring robust industrial development. As of today, do we have any industry that can span over 100 years in Africa? The answer is no. Within 30, 40 years, it's either it's been sold to a white man or the company collapsed. How do we build an intergenerational industry within Africa? It takes our manpower to learn from the Western world, to learn how to build a sustainable economy from the Western world. And we cannot learn by sitting in our comfort zone. Our vibrant youth, our intellectual youth must go into Japan, must go into China, not necessarily looking for grants, but going in there to learn how to build a robust and a sustainable economy. That is the developmental approach that I am talking about. With this, Africa will no longer depend on the 51 billion donation or grant that may lead us into another slavery in the next 100 years. That is the Africa we are looking at. A new Africa is our agenda.
A new Africa, indeed, is the African aspirations of every African, be it the listeners or audience of Talking Points. Meanwhile, while we're proceeding, over to you, Dr. FONGOD. We've seen, like in our previous edition, we're discussing the policy of non-interference within the African continent. Now, we saw recently the Tanzanian, in Tanzania, so to say, where opposition leaders have been arrested. Now, when we see some of these clashes, these political clashes that happen, be it at the level of regions, at the level of nations, could we say that some of these political clashes could be at the center of some of these shaking-ups that we are seeing within the continent of Africa, bearing in mind that, of course, if we have to move forward, Africa needs to be one and indivisible continent?
Yes, absolutely. But the pain for the African, it's really not so much about the difficulties that she's facing on the economic front. It's not the difficulty that she's facing even on the political front. I think that the pain of the African is the fact that she sees what is happening outside of the continent, and then she's looking at the continent in relationship to her millionaires, in relationship to her wealth, and she's asking herself, how can it be that the African lives on the most prosperous in relationship to its natural resources continent on planet Earth, and yet she is suffering in ways that is totally unimaginable. Okay. So when you look at the African literally complaining about everything that is happening within the continent, it is as a result of her sheer frustration as to what it is that is not happening within the continent. We have all the resources, we have the manpower, we have the youngest growing population in the world, we have the capacity to be able to build anything that we want to build, we have the capacity to steer this ship on course and move towards the direction of our destiny, the direction to which it brings the whole entire continent to a place of great prosperity. The only problem we are facing is these individuals who are at the helm, these individuals who are basically controlling the ship. We have pilots, okay, who are flying this gigantic plane called the continent that has no idea where they are going to. They have no idea how to control this massive ship, and sooner or later, if we are not careful, they will tank this thing that will basically cause us to get into a place of no return where the continent becomes decimated, you know, from the weight of sheer exhaustion of the fact that we have done everything that we should have done to be able to push for the progress of the continent, and unfortunately the people we have in places of power had other ideas. How do we get here? We got here because of two factors. Number one, we had men who were pleased by colonial powers to be able to bring about the changes or reforms on the African continent that was Eurocentric in nature, that supported Europe, that supported the West. And secondly, we elected people into power who flashed us or who showed us money rather than a vision. If you show up in a place like Nigeria, there are politicians who will show money before an election and then will tell you guys, we have all of this money, we'll give it to you, and then vote for us. Well, they give you the money. The unfortunate thing is that the people give you the money to vote for them has no vision so far as the nation is concerned. Someone's personal bank account does not translate to the vision of the nation. Number one, there are a lot of things that we need to be able to do so that we can basically bring the whole entire economy up to speed, bring, you know, people bring about a lot of jobs openings, job creation, and get young people working. Unfortunately, most of these people with no vision but with bank accounts, however they make their money in that crooked economy, they did whatever they had to do based upon corruption or whatever. Now they are running, now they're in power, and then the people are suffering because we elected men who showed us a bank account and told us how rich they were. They never told us how they got their money, and now that we have put them in position of power, we place them there with no vision, and therefore the nation is suffering. If you see what is happening around the continent, where we have people who have been, you know, basically arrested, locked up for political ideas because of free speech, they are not allowed to talk, they are not allowed to express, you know, their disdain for what is happening within the structure. That is as a result of the pain that we have created by ourselves by electing people into power with zero qualifications to run, zero qualifications to be able to, lead a nation. And so they are leading the nation based upon our own stupid idea that they could be able, to become our presidents. What we need is to be able to reform that sector, get people who are Pan-Africans, get people who love the continent, get people with a vision, with an idea to lead the nation, and let them be the individuals that tell us exactly what to do, not these people who are basically puppets of the West, whom we elected into places of authority with absolutely no idea who they were, because they presented no vision to us, and then we just elected them because they gave us money. Unfortunately, that has backfired, and right now, we are in places like Nigeria and some other parts of the continent, we are actually paying the price for it.
Thank you so much, Dr. FONGOD. Now, proceed with you, Mr. OPEOLUWA. Your co-panelist, Dr. FONGOD, asked the question, how did Africa get here? Now, while trying to proceed, I would like to ask you, because of the question, because we have several pundits of the view that diplomatic frills, diplomatic tensions between numerous countries, between political figures could be at the center of some of this, say at the center of the destabilization of the African continent. But then, in a way, away from that, while we are forging ahead, while we're looking for solutions, how Africa can get out of this trap, what would you say is the way out of this situation, as far as this numerous conflicts and crises is concerned?
All right. The solution to African economic quagmire and challenges is very, very accessible. Knowledge is available. There are opportunities available to every mankind. But Africa is too busy with power, forgetting that opportunities are surrounding us. So instead of us looking at the opportunities, we are all facing power tussle. Now, where is our solution? Number one, our solution will come from the young and vibrant technocrats within the African space. Young and vibrant technocrats within the African space. Because the solution to the economic challenges of Africa in 1999 is not the same as the year 2024. In 2024, we have moved away from Millennium Development Goals. We are now talking about what? The 17 Sustainable Development Goals. How do we bring out accessible and affordable healthcare system? For us to build a robust agricultural farmland in every region of Africa. When we develop our agricultural sector, the Western world will come looking for solution to food crisis in the global village. So instead of them giving us grants, they will end up bringing their resources into Africa free of charge. And in exchange, we will give them food security. Because we have 4 factors of production: land, labor, entrepreneurship, and capital. We have land, we have labor, we do not have capital. Or we don't have enough capital. So if we can develop our land adequately and appropriately with all sense of intentionality, our land will yield resources, both natural resources, mineral resources, and agricultural resources for us. That will be a bait to bring closer the capital we are expecting from the Western world. And when the capital comes into Africa, then we can develop other power supply, we can develop our energy, we we can develop our healthcare system, we can develop our educational system. So the solution is well accessible. The solution is attainable. But are we ready to follow the path of sustainable development goals? Partnership and collaboration is much more needed within the countries of Africa, more than ever before. Mark my word, partnership and intentional collaboration is much more needed within the countries of Africa. No one is above another. Senegal is not above Cameroon. Mali is not above Nigeria. All the African leaders must collaborate beyond African Union, because African Union is negatively becoming a problem to Africa itself because of oligarchy and oppression. So we need much more of what? Partnership and what? Economic collaboration. This will give us a robust and a sustainable development going forward, that our unborn children will not be a problem to the Western world. That the more than 100 million youths in Africa will become the giants globally instead of becoming slaves to the Western power. These are the attainable solutions that we all must work together and ensure that collaboration, economic partnership within the African sovereignty, this will give us a tenable and a long-lasting economic balance within the shore walls of Africa as a continent in the Committee of Nations and Continents of the world.
Thank you so much, Mr. OPEOLUWA TAIWO, Executive Director at the Africa Bridge Initiative. Now, proceeding with you, you cited in your previous contribution that partnerships and collaborations are of utmost importance when taking the African continent forward. Now, we started this earlier on, and I would like to capitalize on that. When you look at Africa, amidst the numerous challenges and the differences or disparities that exist between different African nations, of what importance it is for African countries to valorize the Ubuntu perspective, the spirit of Ubuntu in getting together as one people. Now, to prioritize partnerships within Africa and collaboration for the betterment of the continent.
All right, thank you for that. Now, one thing we must look at is that when we're talking about partnership for economic development within the African space, two things are involved. Number one is the sportsmanship of African leaders. Number two is the technical capacity of the youth of Africa. Don't forget what I said. Number one, the sportsmanship of African leaders is needed for this collaboration to be smooth. And the second leg that is needed is the technical capacity of the millions of youths of Africa. Now, let me start with the sportsmanship of the leaders. Sportsmanship of African leaders is talking about what? Generational leadership development. Generational leadership development and mentorship. Okay, so for us in Africa Bridge Initiative, as an NGO within the Africa, spanning from Nigeria, what we are advocating, what we are preaching is that there must be mutual global exchange program within the continent of Africa, whereby the youth of Nigeria in the science space can come into Cameroon and understudy the science space of Cameroon. That the youth of Mali can come into the agricultural space of Rwanda to understudy and understand the agricultural capacity of Rwanda. So that is the meaning of that sportsmanship from the African leaders, because it takes the political will, the economical will of the leaders to open up these global Africa exchange programs within the continent of Africa. Now, on the other hand, I spoke about the second leg, talking about what? The technical capacity of the youth of Africa. Because driving this global partnership within Africa can only be seamless through the infusion of what? Technology, through the infusion of artificial intelligence, through the infusion of what? Economic intelligence capacity. So when the youth within Africa can understand that the development of Africa lies in their shoulder, then this partnership will be seamless. Look at the issue of migration. Look at the issue of different embassies within Africa. We need to have a seamless, robust migration policy within Africa, whereby whenever there's any economic activities within Nigeria that will be beneficial to the continent of Africa, Nigeria within that space of time must open up its border for different economic leaders within Africa to come in and explore that economic space. When they explore that economic space, invariably development is going to Rwanda, development is going to Cameroon, development is going to Senegal, development is going to where? Development is going to Niger Republic. But when the youth do not have the technical capacity to open up the economy, then our analysis might end up as a political or economic mirage. So the youth of Africa, we are the real giants that will build the economy of Africa. And we must not be oppressed. We must be allowed to speak our voice at African Union. We must be allowed to speak our economic voice, our intellectual property voice at the ECOWAS. We must be allowed to open up the global space of technology within the coverage of Africa. So with these two legs, Africa will rejoice in the next decades, saying that Africa rise up, and Africa is now the new bride in the Committee of Nations of the 21st century economy.
Thank you so much, Mr. OPEOLUWA. I'll just give you, before I come back to you, I'd like to take Mr. Gilbert Kimbe. And now, I'm listening to what Mr. OPEOLUWA had to say, moving Africa forward. Before we can wrap up today's edition, what do you think Africa needs to do amidst these numerous challenges to be able to emerge as that great continent which Mr. TAIWO has beautifully painted for us?
Okay, you know, for Africa to become a strong and stable continent, it must focus on inclusive governance, regional cooperation, and economic integration. You know, the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFTA, is a positive step that is already aiming to boost trade among African countries. However, economic growth needs to be supported by political reforms, you know, that fight corruption and that ensure all citizens are included in governance. So implementing a decentralized governance model like Nigeria's approach could actually help address local issues and it could also promote national unity. It is also vital to invest in education and job training for young people who make up a large part of the population, and that can drive change. So providing opportunities for youth can help reduce economic, discontent that often leads to conflict. So moreover, strengthening regional organizations like the African Union is crucial. These bodies should play a more active role in preventing and resolving conflicts. It's really very important. And by working together, African nations can actually turn challenges into opportunities for growth, can change this into opportunity for unity and resilience that will pave the way for a brighter and more prosperous future for the continent at large.
Thank you, Mr. Gilbert Kimbi. Now, to conclude today's edition of Talking Points with you, Mr. OPEOLUWA, in just some 30 seconds, could you paint out the way forward for the African continent? 30 seconds, please.
All right. The population of Africa is growing sporadically and is becoming a challenge. But as of today, we must turn around the population of Africa from becoming a challenge. We must turn it around to becoming a prospect for economic surplus and economic development. More manpower should be developed. More manpower should be trained in fintech, in agriculture. More manpower should be trained in 21st century education. That is the education of the future. That is the Africa we are looking for.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. That was Mr. OPEOLUWA TAIWO, Executive Director at the Africa Bridge Initiative, who joined us all the way from Nigeria. Meanwhile, we equally had the participation of Mr. ELVIS, BANEH, political analyst, journalist, and more from Cameroon, and the participation of Dr. Stanley FONGOD, political analyst, a Pan-Africanist, economist, and the CEO of Preston FinTech, as well as Mr. Gilbert Kimbi. In the course of today's edition of the program, we believe you learned a lot from today's exchange of this edition of Talking Point. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your keen attention. Thank you for watching. I'll leave you in our numerous programs.